Hello everyone, my name is David Tucker and welcome to the course AWS Certified Cloud Practitioner ExamPrep. I am a CTO consultant and I help organizations plan, build, and implement custom digital touchpoints in the cloud. And I have over 15 years of experience in software architecture and development. Now this course is the fourth step in the process of preparing for your Certified Cloud Practitioner exam. By this point, you should have completed fundamental cloud concepts for AWS, understanding AWS core services, and an introduction to security and architecture on AWS. In this course, you'll be applying the knowledge from all of the previous courses and learning critical skills for how to take this certification exam. First, you'll explore sample questions that cover the topics contained within this learning path. Next, you'll discover techniques for evaluating questions and managing time during the exam. Finally, you'll be able to evaluate your readiness for the exam by gauging your results from sample questions provided in this course. When you're finished with this course, you'll have the skills and knowledge of the AWS Cloud Practitioner Certification exam to evaluate your readiness for the real thing. Hello, my name is David Tucker, and welcome to the AWS Cloud Practitioner Exam Prep course. I am so excited for this course because I believe it will give you the information to know if you're ready to go sign up and take the AWS Cloud Practitioner exam. And this was added basically by viewer demand. After we released the initial version of the path, they wanted even more content to see if they were ready for the certification exam. And that's what we're providing here. So here's what we're going to do. We have two different sets of sample questions here within this path. We'll talk more about where you can find these sample questions. But what we're going to do is we're going to walk through each of these questions. Sure, you'll have a chance to go through and see if you know the answers to the questions. But then I will walk you through each and every question and let you know how I arrived at the correct answer. Once you get through a whole set of sample questions, you'll be able to determine, am I ready to take the certification exam? And if you need a little bit more practice, not a problem. We have a whole other set of sample questions that you can work your way through. By the time you get to the end of this course, you'll know whether or not you're ready to take the AWS Cloud Practitioner exam. Okay, so if you're ready to get started, here's what you need to do. Use your browser and go download the exercise files for this video course. That'll download a zip file to your computer. Inside of that zip file, you'll find two sets of sample questions and some sample answer sheets that you can use. I would recommend setting aside a dedicated period of time to go through each set of sample questions. Start off with Exam Prep A and work through and write down your answers to each of these questions. Once you've gone through that entire process and you've completed all of Exam Prep A, tune in to the clips that follow to get the answers and to understand not only the correct answer, but also how to think about the correct answer so that you'll be able to arrive at the correct answer when you find a similar question on the exam. Now, once you're through with that, you can gauge your results, and I'll have a clip at the end of this module that will enable you to go through and check how you've done. Now, if you still need more practice, that's why we have Exam Prep B. You can do the exact same thing for Exam Prep B. And once you get done with this course, you'll be able to determine if you're ready to sign up and take the AWS Certified Cloud Practitioner exam. So now we're going to walk through questions 1 to 10 of question set A. And as a reminder, I believe this is the best way to prepare for a certification exam by reviewing sample questions as well as the logic for how to arrive at the correct answer. So here we have question 1. Your organization has decided to adopt infrastructure as code with AWS CloudFormation for new infrastructure launched into your AWS accounts. Which pillar of the well-architected framework is this recommendation included in? I think you should definitely memorize the 5 different pillars of the well-architected framework and understand at a high level what recommendations are included within each of these. And in this case, we can see first, fault tolerance is not a pillar, so we can remove that as a possible answer. And always go through if there is a question that you don't immediately know the right answer and eliminate the answers that are just not possible. We can also look here at both security and cost optimization, and we can see that they're really not connected to infrastructure as code. You theoretically could spin up some very insecure and costly infrastructure using infrastructure as code. Really here what we're talking about is Operational excellence, and that's why the correct answer is A. Now for question 2, your company is moving a self-managed database over to AWS, and it will be running on EC2 for at least 3 years. They want to avoid any large expenses up front, but want to reduce the monthly cost as much as possible. What EC2 pricing model should you recommend? Well, if we look at this here, we can see first of all, they're going to be running this for 3 years. And in this case, the fact that it's a self-managed database really doesn't factor into the answer. So if we look at this, a dedicated host is going to be way more expensive. An on-demand instance is not really going to give us any cost savings here. So we're going to be looking at one of the 2 reserved options. Now here we can see that there is a no upfront and a partial upfront option. And so if we look here, we can see that they want to avoid any large expenses upfront. So that means here we're probably looking at a no upfront option. And just by going through that process, we can see here that the correct answer for this one has to be B. So here we have question 3. What is the least costly support plan that provides 24/7 access to documentation, white papers, and support forums? Well, here in this case, we're going to choose the plan that has the least cost. Now, I want to call this out because you likely will have questions that are similar to this on the exam. That means you want to find the option here that gives this capability but yet costs the least. And in this case, the answer is it's going to be free because the basic plan does include access to documentation, white papers, and support forums. Next, here for question 4, you want to launch multiple EC2 instances that all have the same operating system customizations. What would you need to create so that each of these instances included those customizations? Well, here, an S3 bucket's not going to help you. A virtual private cloud, again, is a virtual private network that you can utilize and configure within the cloud, and an elastic file system here really is a place for you to store network files with an NFS mount. So if we're looking at this, really the viable answer here has to be an Amazon Machine Image, or AMI. So next we have question 5. Which managed service could provide distribution of incoming traffic across multiple Amazon EC2 instances? Well, here the service is Elastic Load Balancing, or C, but I want to call out something here. Elastic Beanstalk can actually have a component of load balancing included in it. But here, this is going to be a little bit different. We're asking it to distribute traffic across multiple Amazon EC2 instances that we control. So in this case, it might be a bit tricky, but the answer here is going to be C instead of B. Now next, we have question 6. Your organization has decided to experiment with machine learning for a specific business problem. Later the same day, the team has a machine learning environment up and running in AWS to begin experimentation. Which cloud benefit is illustrated in this scenario? Okay, so let's look at these possible answers. Loose coupling is more a way of how we build software in the cloud and how we have them in smaller units that can communicate with each other. That really isn't what we're talking about here. Also, agility. Now that could be a possible answer, so let's think on that one, but let's keep moving down the list. Here, design for failure. Well, we don't really see that here. We're not talking about failure at all. And elasticity. We're not really talking here about the ability to scale. So really, it has to be B, which is agility, because this enables organizations to move quickly, and that's what we're seeing here. Within the same day, they're able to set up a machine learning environment that they can work in. So we have a question here, which of the following are pillars of the AWS well-architected framework? Now, you know that earlier I talked about this in question 1, so this is another value of memorizing the 5 different pillars. And we can see here that there are 2 that are not pillars, fault tolerance and high availability. And both of those would actually fall under the reliability pillar, which isn't here. But that means that B, C, and D are going to be the correct answers. Now next, we have question 8. Which element of the AWS global infrastructure consists of multiple availability zones? So we have edge location, region, point of presence, and data center. Now in this case, an availability zone is a grouping of 1 or more data centers, and those, when we have groups of availability zones, that's what we would call a region. So here, don't be confused by edge locations or points of presence here. Here, we're going to be talking about regions if we're talking about multiple availability zones. Now for question 9, what feature of a virtual private cloud, or VPC, works like a virtual firewall for the network? Well, in this case, we can look at these different terms and evaluate them. Subnets, well, that's not a firewall, they're a subnet. And then we have virtual private gateways, or VPGs, that has to do with a VPN connection. Then we have security groups and internet gateways. internet gateways are going to be how we can access the internet from our VPC, but security groups are going to be how we actually configure what can access our VPC. So in that case, it is working like a virtual firewall. So here we would choose C for the correct answer. Now we have question 10. Which AWS service enables organizations to create a private link between their data center and an AWS region that doesn't travel over the public internet? Now, I should call this out here whenever you're dealing with this category of questions, and these questions are going to cover topics like VPN and Direct Connect and other things. Here, you need to know whether or not it's going to be traveling over the public internet. So that is a key component of this particular question. So if we wanted to do this in a way that does travel over the public internet, we would look at a VPN type solution. But if we're looking at something that doesn't travel over the internet, we're going to be looking at A, AWS Direct Connect, because this is the service that enables you to have a private, dedicated connection between your data center and an AWS region. So now that we've navigated questions 1 to 10, we're going to be looking at questions 11 to 20. So here in question 11, which service provides nearly limitless object storage with multiple storage classes covering use cases from frequent access to archive storage? Now, this is what I call a service identification question. You're given a description of a service and you simply need to select which service it is. And this is where your service list that was included earlier in the path is going to be essential. This will help you review the right material. So in this case, if we're looking for a service that provides object storage and one that has the characteristics listed here, it's going to be Amazon S3. Amazon EFS, again, is a network file store, and EBS is a block store that can be attached to EC2 instances. And neither of those are what we're talking about here. And AWS Cloud Storage, at least as of the recording of this particular course, isn't a thing. So if we look next at question 12, which service can give you a secure and encrypted connection to a virtual private cloud on AWS over the public internet? Now, as a reminder, and I mentioned this in the last clip, over the public internet is a key part of this question. Because if we said here, not over the public internet, we would actually have a different answer. But here, what we're going to be looking at is C, AWS Virtual Private Network, or VPN. So anytime you're talking about going over the public internet and a secure and encrypted connection, that's going to be the approach that you would take. Next, question 13. Your organization frequently deploys a standard web application stack for new applications. What AWS service would enable them to define this common infrastructure in code and also detect any drift to the stack configuration of a deployed application? Now, there's a lot of words here that have to do with infrastructure as code. So what we're talking about is the ability to define this in code and then deploy it and then detect changes to it. Well, the only service that's going to give us that capability here is going to be CloudFormation. So anytime that you see something about defining your infrastructure as code, CloudFormation should be one of your go-to answers. Now next, in question 14, we say which pricing factors are considered when using AWS Lambda. And this is a multi-answer question, so we're going to need to pick 2 of these options. Well, in this case, we're not going to be charged for the number of instances, the maximum concurrent instances, or the instance size. Those are more things that we're dealing with when we're talking about EC2 instances, for example. But when we're dealing with Lambda, we are going to be charged for the duration that it takes for our functions to complete execution and the number of requests. Now, duration here also gives us the ability to specify this based on the memory allocated. Next, for question 15, which architectural principle is illustrated in the following statement? Isolate the behavior of a component from other components that depend on it, increasing resiliency and agility. So this comes from the documentation, and in this case, what we're talking about is something about loose coupling. Now, loose coupling is a good architectural principle, at least in general, and tight coupling is something we generally try to avoid. High availability and least privilege access are both good things, but they're not tied to this particular statement that's given for this question. So next we have question 16. Which tool can be used to automate the creation and management of multiple AWS account environments? Now, when you hear multiple accounts, you might immediately think, oh, this is AWS organizations, but you don't see that here in the list of answers. Here we're looking for something a little bit different, because if you notice here, we're looking for something that can automate the creation and management. Well, in this case, that's going to be AWS Control Tower, because this is going to help you implement AWS best practices for managing multiple accounts. Next, we have question 17. Which AWS service allows you to manage multiple AWS accounts, simplify billing for all accounts, and apply policies for governance of those accounts? Well, in this case, we're going to be looking for something that's similar to the previous question, but instead of looking for a control tower here, we're looking for the actual service that enables you to unify billing for multiple accounts and apply those policies for governance. Now, directory service doesn't do that for us. AWS accounts, no, that's not what we're looking for. CloudFormation is tied to infrastructure as code. AWS organizations is what we're going to look for this, because this is the core service that Control Tower uses to create that multi-account environment. Next, we have question 18. Which AWS managed service provides the ability to set up and manage relational databases for the most common database engines? So as a note here, be sure to look out for whether we're talking about relational or NoSQL databases in the questions you're going to see on the exam. Because if we're looking for NoSQL databases, that's when we're going to be looking at things like DynamoDB. But when we're talking about relational databases, we're going to be looking at services like RDS. And if we look at the answers here, we know that DynamoDB is not going to be the correct answer because it's not relational. SimpleDB is also not going to be the answer we're looking for. And while the database migration tool can work with relational databases, it doesn't give us the ability to set up and manage relational databases. So because of that, the answer for this one has to be B. Next, we have question 19. What AWS service can be leveraged in the deployment of your custom software to Amazon EC2 and AWS Fargate? Well, in this case, the key word in the question is deployment, because all of these could theoretically be involved in the process of releasing software, but only one service is designed to handle the deployment to Amazon EC2 and Fargate, and that's going to be AWS Code Deploy. Next, we have question 20. Which service provides a NoSQL cloud database with single-digit millisecond latency that operates as a key value and document store? So this is another service identification question. That means you need to figure out which service's description most closely matches this question. And as I've mentioned before, if we're looking for a NoSQL cloud database, in most cases we're going to be talking about DynamoDB. And this is something that more than likely will show up more than a few times on the exam. So next, we're going to be going through questions 21 to 30. So here, the first question, which of the following would not be factored into a TCO comparison analysis of switching to the cloud from a traditional data center? Now this question probably sounds a little bit confusing, so let me break it apart for you. We're basically looking here for costs that would remain the same or relatively the same, no matter whether we're in the cloud or in a traditional data center. Because when you do a TCO comparison analysis, you're trying to highlight areas where the costs are going to be vastly different, or some costs that we might not even have if we move to the cloud. So here, if we look at this cost of purchasing data center hardware, well, that's going to be very different because we're not going to have to buy that hardware if we're operating in the cloud. Custom software development, well, that's something that's probably going to be pretty similar no matter whether we're in our own data center or the cloud. So let's note that as a possible answer here. Then we have utility costs for a data center. Well, we don't have to pay those if we're in the cloud, so that's going to be very different. And the cost of purchasing servers, that's something else that's going to be very different because we won't have to do that in the cloud. So really here, the correct answer, the only one that it can be, is B, custom software development. Then we have question 22. Within the shared responsibility model, which areas would be the responsibility of the customer? So as a note here, you need to know the shared responsibility model very well in preparation for the exam. Make sure you know what is the responsibility of AWS, the customer, and what items are shared. Here, we're going to look for the customer, the items that are the customer's responsibility. I'm quickly going to look at the answers that just couldn't be possible. First of all, management of edge locations. You don't have the ability to really do any management of edge locations as a customer. Also, AWS is totally responsible for the data center network connectivity, which is D. So in this case, if we eliminate those two, and we're looking for 3 correct answers, we know that it has to be B, C, and E for the correct answer. Next, 23. Which disaster recovery approach would result in the lowest cost? So when we're looking at disaster recovery, be sure you understand what the lowest cost would be. Also be sure that you understand what the fastest and slowest approaches for disaster recovery would be. These are the kinds of questions you're likely to see on the exam. So here, if we're trying to figure out the one that would be the lowest cost, that's going to be backup and restore, because that's the one where you don't have to have backup infrastructure up and running. You simply would actually spin that up if there was a disaster recovery event. Next, we have question 24. How will implementing elasticity in your cloud application reduce your total cost of ownership, or TCO, over implementing it in your traditional data center? Well, here, if we look at this, we're going to have to analyze each of these answers. And this is the type of question you might want to spend just a little bit of time making sure you thoroughly read the question and the answer, because it's a little bit harder to analyze than just a service identification question. So here, if we look at the different answers, increasing compute capability, well, that doesn't necessarily change our total cost of ownership. Increasing unused capacity, well, that doesn't sound like a good thing, because we don't want to be increasing stuff that we're not actually using. Next, we have reducing unused capacity, and that sounds like a promising answer, but let's look at the next one. Increasing speed of data transfer. Well, that's another thing that's a good thing. However, that doesn't necessarily mean reducing our total cost of ownership. So here, the answer is going to be C, reducing unused capacity, meaning that when you're in the cloud, you don't have to have a bunch of servers sitting around and doing nothing that you're paying for, unlike in your own data center. Next, for question 25, which fully managed AWS service uses machine learning to both detect and protect your data that is stored in AWS? So this is a service identification question. And so if we look here through the list of possible options, really only one is going to be something we would consider. So CloudFormation is about infrastructure as code. GuardDuty is more focused on our network traffic. Network access control lists, or ACLs, are more a feature of our VPCs. So here, if we're looking for a managed AWS service, it's going to be Amazon Macie. Next, for 26, you are looking to move a new web application into the cloud. Your organization has asked for a cost estimate on this application. What tool could you use to estimate the cost for this new cloud workload? So we're looking to estimate costs for something that we haven't even started working on yet. So in that case, we're not going to use Cost Explorer, because Cost Explorer is going to be useful in both looking at historical costs and predicting future costs. Trusted Advisor only deals with things that have already been deployed. The pricing calculator seems like a promising answer here. And then cost and usage reports, again, also only deals with historical. So the answer here is going to be C. Next, question 27. Which of the following services is a highly available managed domain name system, or DNS service? So this is just a basic service identification question. We're trying to figure out what is a DNS service. So if we look at all of these options, the answer to that is going to be Amazon Route 53. And if you don't know that right off the top of your head, I would encourage you to go back and review the service list that were provided earlier within this path. Next, question 28. Your organization is working on an incident management and investigation policy now that they have moved a pilot application onto the cloud with AWS. Which pillar of the AWS well-architected framework recommends the creation of this policy? So here, the incident management and investigation policy has to do with the security of our application. You're basically building up a policy of what happens when there is an incident related to security. Now, knowing that, it's going to be pretty easy to pick B as the correct answer here. But this is why I recommend that you go through and review each of the pillars and the recommendations included with them. You do need to memorize the 5 different pillars, but if you take a little bit of time and just read through the different recommendations, you'll be able to come to the correct answer when you come to a question like this. Next, we have question 29. According to the concept of least privilege access, what should you set up when adding permissions for an IAM user? Now, as a reminder, least privilege access means that you're going to give users the bare minimum permissions needed to accomplish the jobs that they need to accomplish in a specific AWS account. And if we look through all of these, including giving them a separate AWS account or giving them access to all services, with this, we're going to have to choose an option that matches that definition. And the only one here that matches that definition is going to be C. Next, we have question 30. You are looking to launch a static website with minimal configuration. Which of the following AWS services provides this feature? So here, static website hosting is going to be a feature of one of these services. Well, CloudWatch is all about monitoring logs and metrics. That's not going to be it. Redshift is a cloud scale data warehousing solution. That's not going to be it. Code Deploy helps you deploy things, but only to EC2 instances and to Fargate, and that's really not what we're talking about here. And Amazon S3 does have this capability. So in this case, that's going to be the correct answer we're looking for. So next, we're going to talk through questions 31 to 40. So here, question 31, which online tool provides guidance in following AWS best practices by providing personalized recommendations for your cloud workloads. So one of the key words here to look for is personalized, which means it's going to be based on what you've already launched within your account. So here we have AWS Trusted Advisor, AWS Personal Health Dashboard, AWS Well-Architected Framework, and Amazon CloudWatch. Well, here, if we're looking for recommendations here for the workloads, we're not going to be looking at the Well-Architected Framework because it's not personalized. Amazon CloudWatch isn't going to give us recommendations. It's just going to give us metrics and logs for what we need to do. So here, if we're really looking for this, we're going to be looking at the Trusted Advisor. Because while the Personal Health Dashboard does give personalized data, it's not going to be the recommendations that it's talking about here. Next, we have question 32. Your organization is looking to review best practices for AWS prior to implementing their first cloud application. What resource would best meet this need? So in this case, if we're wanting to review best practices, really Trusted Advisor is not going to be what we're looking for yet because they haven't implemented anything. CloudFormation is going to be about infrastructure as code. That's not what we need here. The marketplace isn't going to be what we need here either because that's going to be where we go to get software that's been kind of pre-bundled to work within AWS. So the answer to this one is going to be the Well-Architected Framework. And as a reminder, be sure you know those pillars of the framework for the exam. Next, question 33, what is the minimum AWS support plan that provides the complete set of AWS Trusted Advisor checks? And here, this is where you just need to go through and memorize the different support plans. There's not a ton of detail associated with each one, so just be sure you've taken time to review that before the exam. And in this case, it's going to be the business plan is going to give you the full set of Trusted Advisor checks. Now the enterprise plan also has that, but it says here in the question, the minimum support plan. So in this case, the answer is going to be B, business. Next, in question 34, which AWS service enables you to protect your web application by using a rule-based system to detect traffic and actions that should be blocked? So here with this one, we're specifically looking for a web application service. And also here we're looking at a rule-based system. So for this, there's really only one service that meets that criteria, and that's going to be the Web Application Firewall. But again, this is going to be targeted at web applications. Next, we have question 35. Your US-based team wants to expand an internal application to your office in Singapore. They are able to take the application and spin up a version in the AP Southeast 1 region. Which benefit of cloud computing is best illustrated with this scenario? Now, to be honest here, just don't overthink questions like this. This one's going to be pretty simple. This gives you the ability to go global in minutes. All the others are benefits we could talk about as well, but here in this case, that's really what we're focusing on. Next, we have question 36. Within the shared responsibility model, what area would be the responsibility of the customer? So here we have patching data center network routers. Well, that's not going to be the customer's responsibility. You don't even have access to those. Patching the OS for RDS instances. You also don't have access to the OS level of RDS instances. Then we have data center security. Well, that's something that's definitely the purview of AWS. So really, even before we've read D, we know it pretty much has to be D. But if we look at it, patching the OS on EC2 instances, yes, that's definitely something that's the customer's responsibility, and that's the correct answer. Next, we have question 37. What will IAM users use to authenticate themselves when using the AWS CLI? So here we have group credentials, access keys per IAM user, username and password, and access keys for the root user. Well, in this case, the answer is going to be access keys per IAM user. If we look at access keys for the root user, AWS actually recommends you don't even use those for the root user, and username and password doesn't work with the CLI. And also here, group credentials wouldn't be something we would consider. Each user needs to have their own credentials. So that means the answer to this one is going to be B. Next, what AWS service enables auditing of your AWS account by logging actions taken on your AWS resources? So this is another service identification question. And here in this case, if we look at Cloud HSM, that's about storing our encryption keys. CloudFormation is about infrastructure as code. GuardDuty is about monitoring traffic. So really here, the viable option is going to be CloudTrail, which does exactly what it says here, logging the actions that are taken on your AWS resources. Next, we have question 39. How can you configure the same permissions for multiple IAM users? And really what we're talking about here is how to manage multiple users and those permissions so you don't end up having a maintenance nightmare. Now, the first possible answer that's given here is having multiple users use the same IAM user account. And that always goes against best practices. You would never want to do that. And if we look at C, it talks about IAM roles. Now, there's a lot you can do with IAM roles, but in the context of this exam, when we're talking about roles, we're really talking about services, AWS services, assuming a role. So when we're talking about IAM users, what we really need to do here is look at something that utilizes IAM groups, and that's going to be B. Next, for question 40, which service enables you to use your own keys to encrypt data on AWS using a hardware security module or HSM? So if we look at these, we have AWS Key Management Service, and this actually does enable us to use our own keys to encrypt data. However, it doesn't use a hardware security module or HSM. We then have Cloud HSM, and as a hint, that one's going to be the correct answer. We also have Identity and Access Management and Macie, and those really aren't connected to what we're looking at here. So the correct answer is definitely going to be B. So next, we have questions 41 to 50. And here's the first question. Your organization is adopting a hybrid approach for storage and wants to leverage the cloud as a backup while having low latency access to data on its local network. Which AWS service could be leveraged for this? So here, hybrid is going to be a key word here. And this is a question about a hybrid cloud approach. And with this, there's a couple of services that we've talked about that really tie in well to that. And that's going to be Storage Gateway and Route 53. They both have the ability to work in a hybrid cloud environment. And here, Storage Gateway is included as one of the answers. So that's likely going to be the answer. And if we look at the other options, we can quickly check them off as not viable solutions because Elastic Block Store is about block storage for EC2 instances. That's not what we're talking about. And then S3 and S3 Glacier both give us storage, but don't have low latency access on a local network outside of AWS. So in this case, Storage Gateway is our correct answer. Next, we have question 42. Which service provides an in-memory data store that supports both Redis and Memcached? Well, in this case, that's going to be Elasticache. This is another just service identification question. EFS is Elastic File System, which gives us a network NFS mount. RDS is Relational Database Service, and then DynamoDB is our NoSQL database. So here, Elasticache is going to be the only viable answer. Next, for 43, when deploying an application across multiple availability zones, which design concept are you implementing? So here, the reason that we deploy across multiple availability zones is so that if one availability zone were to fail, even entirely, our application could still be up and running. So is that elasticity? No, because we're not talking necessarily about scale. Agility? Not necessarily here. Design for failure? And that really sounds like what it is because here we're designing for the potential failure of an availability zone, and then cost optimization. And that's not going to be the case either because truthfully, deploying to multiple availability zones is going to be a little bit more costly. So here the answer is going to be design for failure. Next, for question 44, which AWS concept is the definition of the information required to launch an EC2 instance, including the contents of the root volume, launch permissions, and block device mapping? So here we need to figure out what is this the definition for? Well, in this case, it's going to be Amazon Machine Image or AMI. That's what's required to launch an EC2 instance. We look at the other options here. Elastic Block Store, again, is for block storage for our EC2 instances. Elastic File System is a network file system for our EC2 instances. And then the last one, EC2 Instance Image, isn't actually a thing. So in this case, the correct answer is going to be A. Now for question 45, your organization is looking to test a new web application concept. The team set up an AWS account and infrastructure within a day on which they would build a prototype for this application. Which cloud computing benefit does this illustrate? So if we look at the options here, go global in minutes. We don't see anything about being global here. Stop guessing capacity. We really haven't talked much about capacity yet. We then have increase speed and agility, and that one sounds like a potential answer because we are able to move quickly here. That's part of what this question is illustrating. And then we have hybrid cloud, but we don't see anything here about using our own data center alongside the cloud. So here, C is the only viable answer. Next, for 46, which element of the AWS global infrastructure is made up of one or more data centers connected by a low latency network with redundant power, networking, and connectivity within an AWS region? So as a note here, when we see within an AWS region, that means we're going to be looking usually at an availability zone, D, because a region is made up of multiple availability zones. Other options here, like edge location, that is a part of the AWS global infrastructure, but we don't see this within an AWS region. Next, for question 47, how can you improve the security of your IAM user account? So here, we're not talking about the security of our infrastructure, but the security of our user account. And if we look at these different options, most of these are focused on improving the security of what we launch, such as using Amazon Shield or AWS VPN, or even using Amazon Macie to look at protecting our data. But the only option here that's tied to our user account is C, enable multi-factor authentication. Now for question 48, your company is looking to perform batch data analysis using an EC2 instance. There is a flexible start and stop time for this workload, and it can stop and restart as needed. What would be the most cost-effective EC2 pricing model given these requirements? So, as a note here, when you're looking at anything about EC2 pricing models, if you see that it says that it can start and stop without affecting the workload, meaning that it can stop and restart as needed without any problems, you're usually going to choose a spot instance because that is the cheapest way to utilize Amazon EC2. However, if you see something that says it can't start and stop, then you wouldn't be able to choose a spot instance. This does work here, so A is going to be our correct answer. And next, we have 49. Your company is using the AWS Customer Carbon Footprint tool to determine the environmental impact of their current cloud workloads. They are planning to use this information to optimize future workloads. Which pillar of the well-architected framework would this fit into? Well, let's start off here by looking at B and C. We know that both of these are indeed pillars of the well-architected framework, but they're not really dealing with what we're talking about here. Operational excellence has to do with how we run and monitor our workloads, and performance efficiency has to do with making sure that we only have the things running that we need to have running for the business value that we want to achieve. So at this point, it's likely A or D. And if you remember from the 6 pillars, it is indeed A. While D sounds correct, that actually is not a pillar, and this is why it's so important to have those 6 pillars memorized before you go into the exam. So next we have question 50. When you deploy your application across multiple AWS availability zones, which architectural principle are you implementing? And this is very similar to a question that we had earlier within this set of sample questions. So here, when we have multiple AWS availability zones, we're implementing high availability, meaning that our application can stay available even if there is a failure of a complete availability zone. Loose coupling is a good principle, and that talks about us breaking our application into smaller components that know how to communicate with each other, but that's not tied here to multiple availability zones. Cross-region reliability is not what we're talking about here, because really multiple availability zones exist within a single AWS region and not multiple ones. And tight coupling here is an architectural principle we generally try to avoid in the cloud. So we're getting down to the home stretch here. We're going to be looking here at questions 51 to 60. So here, with question 51, it's your company needs to launch a MySQL database in the cloud for a web application. They will need to have access to the underlying operating system to install OS-level optimizations. What solution would meet these requirements? So the important thing to note here is that you're going to need to have access to the operating system. That means utilizing RDS, or Relational Database Service, is not going to be an option. So even though MySQL is supported within RDS, you're not going to have the ability to get access to that operating system. So that means that option B here is not going to work. Now option A isn't going to work because you can't launch MySQL inside of DynamoDB. DynamoDB is its own engine. And if we look here at D, Amazon SimpleDB is also not going to work. So the only viable answer we have here is C, which is utilize MySQL on Amazon EC2. Next, for question 52, your company is migrating to the cloud. You have multiple licenses for server software that is licensed per server. Which EC2 pricing model should you choose for the instances when you launch them in AWS? Well, in this case, it's going to be B, dedicated host. So the way that you can make sure that you're abiding by a per server license that really wasn't a license made for the cloud is going to be to use the dedicated host option. Next, for question 53, which tool enables you to visualize current AWS costs and predict future costs based on current usage? So this is a tool definition question. So this is the definition for one of the tools in this list. So the pricing calculator really is only about predicting future workloads. So you go in and say what services you want to use, and it'll spit back out an estimated cost. Then you have Trusted Advisor, which is going to give you recommendations based on how you're using AWS. That's also not what we're looking at here. Cost and usage reports, in this case, don't really visualize anything for you. They also don't provide insights into what future costs could be. So the answer here is going to be D, because this is exactly what the AWS Cost Explorer provides. Next, for question 54, which AWS service would enable you to share reserved instances across multiple accounts that your company manages? And this is another great feature of AWS organizations. Again, CloudWatch is about metrics and logs. That's not going to be what we're looking for here. CloudFormation is infrastructure as code. That's not going to be what we're looking for here. And Direct Connect is about giving our data center a connection to an AWS region. So the answer here needs to be A. Next, for question 55, you want to have email support within business hours from AWS for an application you are building. What is the minimum support plan that provides this? So this is another support plan question. And if you want to have email support within business hours, you're going to need to have the developer plan. Now, again, if you want to have this for a minimum support plan, then you would select developer. Basic does not include this. Now, enterprise and business actually provides even more than this, but because the question says what is the minimum support plan, you would choose developer. For question 56, which service provides a highly available and elastic NFS file system for both cloud-based and on-premise servers? So here, if you know NFS, this is going to be a service that provides this. So if we look at both Amazon S3 and S3 Glacier, neither of those provide an NFS file system. Also, if we look at Elastic Block Store, this is just going to be block storage for our EC2 instances, so that's not going to be what we need. This means the answer here needs to be the Amazon Elastic File System, or EFS. Then if we look at question 57, if you wanted to engage AWS resources for a paid engagement to assist in a cloud migration, which team would you leverage? So we're going to work from the bottom up with this. So first of all, if we look at the AWS Partner Network consulting partners, these are not going to be AWS resources. These are going to be other consulting companies that give you this capability. If we look at Service Gateway, that's not going to be what we're looking for here. And if we look at Marketplace, as we've mentioned before, it's going to be the place where you go for independent software vendors to package their software for deployment in the cloud. So really, AWS Professional Services is going to be what we're looking for here with this. Now, for question 58, your company is moving their data storage from their data center into the cloud. They are evaluating different approaches for data warehousing. What AWS service provides a managed data warehousing solution that supports columnar storage up to a petabyte in scale? So this is a service identification question. And if we look at this, really there's only one option. So the database migration services we've talked about is just moving data into the cloud, potentially into an RDS instance, for example. And then DynamoDB and SimpleDB are both databases, and Redshift is going to be the type of data store we're looking for here, one that's focused on data warehousing with columnar storage. Next, for question 59, within the shared responsibility model, what responsibility is shared by both the customer and AWS? As a reminder, you need to be very familiar with the shared responsibility model. And here we're looking at the things that are shared by both. So customer data, well, that's going to be the responsibility of the customer. Data center physical security is going to be the responsibility of AWS. Configuration management, that might be our answer here, because AWS is going to be responsible for the configuration of the underlying layers we're working in, but we're going to be responsible for the configuration of our instances and the infrastructure that we spin up. And for D, we have edge location management, and that's something that's definitely under the AWS purview. So that means our answer here for 59 is C. Next, for question 60, which of the following is an economic benefit of migrating to the cloud? So with these economic questions, be sure you read them thoroughly and understand what is being stated by each of the answers. So here we have eliminating operational expenditures, which is OpEx. Well, we know that we don't eliminate operational expenditures. We actually have operational expenditures in moving to the cloud. Next, we have increased capitalized expenditures, or CapEx. And this also isn't true, because here in this case, we're not looking to increase capitalized expenditures. We should be able to eliminate many of them because we don't have that upfront cost. Next, we have increased operational expenditures, or OpEx. And ideally here, we're able to actually reduce those instead of increasing them. So that means that our answer here pretty much has to be D, reducing the total cost of ownership in the cloud. So now we're going to be working through the final questions in question set A. So let's look here at question 61. Which AWS service provides the ability to assess and audit configuration of the AWS resources you have deployed in your account? So this is another service identification question. And some of the key words here are assessing and auditing configuration. So if we look at this, CloudWatch doesn't give us that capability because it's really, again, about metrics and logs. Identity and access management is about how we configure permissions for users and services. And GuardDuty is, again, about network traffic. So if we look at these, the only viable answer is AWS config because it gives us the ability to do an initial analysis and then, as mentioned, auditing that configuration as needed. Now with question 62, your company has deployed a new web application across multiple availability zones for high availability. What pillar of the well-architected framework recommends this approach? And this is another reason why I say you should memorize the 5 different pillars of the well-architected framework. So in this case, the answer is going to be C, reliability. You might get confused because this process is about fault tolerance. However, that is not a pillar of the well-architected framework. The reliability pillar, however, is. Next, for question 63, which of the following services could assist in migrating your data from your on-premise data center into AWS? So this is going to talk about how we get data from one place to another. So if we look at CloudFormation, it really doesn't work in that space. CloudWatch doesn't work in that space. Cloud Migrate is actually not a service, at least as of the recording of this particular course, but AWS Snowball does specialize in this. This is where you can get sent a rugged storage device, you can put your data on and then send it back to AWS and they will put it into Amazon S3. So the answer here would be C. Next, for question 64, when your team moved an application into the cloud, they implemented elasticity so that the application could scale to meet the current user demand. Which cloud computing benefit is best illustrated with this scenario? So in this case, we're talking about elasticity and scaling to meet current user demand. So if we look at these different benefits, first we have stop spending money running and maintaining data centers. Well, in this case, that is a good benefit, but that's not what we're talking about here. Next, going global in minutes. That's also not something we're talking about here. Trading capital expense for a variable expense. That's not what we're talking about. But when we get to D, stop guessing capacity. The reason we can stop guessing capacity is because by implementing elasticity, we can scale to meet user demand. So our answer here is D. Now, for our last question, question 65. Your organization is looking to leverage both their traditional data center and the public cloud. What type of cloud architecture does this describe? Well, that is the definition of a hybrid cloud. Here, a private cloud would be something that doesn't connect to a public cloud, and the public cloud is just if we're using AWS without our own data center. So hybrid cloud is going to be the answer here.
Okay, so you've made it through ExamPrep A. How did you do? Well, I would say that if you have less than 80% correct, meaning if you got less than 52 questions correct, I think you need to proceed on to ExamPrep B to get even more practice. Now, with that being said, only you can determine if you're ready to take the certification exam. I can't guarantee that you're going to pass, but I'm simply trying to give you some guidelines that you can use when you're determining if you're ready. But even if you did get 80% correct and you just want some more practice, feel free to go through the exact same process in the next module with the questions under ExamPrep B. I'll do the exact same thing and walk you through each of the answers as well as how I arrived at that answer. And like I said, I believe this is the best way for you to get ready to take your Certified Cloud Practitioner exam.
So now you're going to have even more opportunities to prepare for the exam as we go through the ExamPrep B questions. Now, if you haven't done this already, if you haven't reviewed the questions, you can pause this video, go and review the questions and write down your answers on the answer sheet. But if you're ready to go, we're going to start off here with questions 1 to 10. So let's kick it off with question 1. Which of the following services would be considered services to leverage in a serverless architecture? And this is a multi-answer question, so we need to select 3. Now, there are a couple of these that are clearly not serverless in nature, meaning that we have to manage the underlying instances and infrastructure. The first is Amazon EC2, because this is where we are managing virtual machines at the virtual machine level. And the other is Elasticache, where we have to manage specific instances and deal with things like scalability on our own. So here, the other 3 services, Lambda, SQS, and DynamoDB,
are all services where we don't have to do that. So these would be our serverless services. Now, I've also indicated in your services list from earlier in this path the services that you should watch out for when you have a serverless question. Next, we have question 2. Which of the following is an economic benefit of utilizing the cloud? Now, with any economic benefit questions, be sure you read and understand each of the possible answers. Sometimes just a single word can change what the answer is getting at. So first, let's start from the bottom up and let's look at answer D, increased TCO. Well, here we're looking for a benefit, and increasing our cost is never going to be a benefit, so that's not going to be an answer. Next, we have cost is unrelated to usage. Well, this is also the opposite of a benefit, because one of the great things about moving into the cloud is that our cost is tied to our usage. So when we have low usage, we pay less. The next possible answer is B, no operational expenditures. Now, this would be a benefit, but this is also impossible. The monthly fee that we pay to AWS would be an operational expenditure, so this is not the correct answer. So that means the answer must be A, no upfront capitalized expenditures, and that is indeed the answer. And if you remember, the reason that we don't have large upfront capitalized expenditures is that we don't have to build out our own data centers. Next, we have question 3. You will be testing the migration of an on-premise web server to the cloud. You plan to have this instance up for a few weeks while you verify its performance. Which EC2 pricing model should you use? Now, when we're looking at EC2 pricing models, we want to look at 3 things. First of all, we want to know how long the instance is going to be up for. We want to know if it requires dedicated server licensing, and we want to know if it's flexible, meaning that we can start and stop the instance without affecting the overall workload. So with this, we don't see that we have any dedicated server licensing, and this is probably not flexible because it doesn't say that it's flexible, and also it's a web server, so that needs to be up to serve whatever content it's serving. So with this being said, and knowing that we only have to have this up for a few weeks, we're going to choose on-demand instance. If this was going to be up for 1 or 3 years, we could look at a reserved instance. If it needed dedicated server licensing, we would have to look at a dedicated instance. If it could start and stop without any problem, we could look at a spot instance, but given this criteria, we'll choose on demand. Now, for question 4, your company is launching a new EC2 web server that will be running consistently for at least a year. The company wants to find maximum cost savings for this instance. What pricing model should they choose? So here we get another chance to look at an EC2 pricing model question. Now, here we can see that it's a web server. We can assume here that it doesn't have flexibility to start and stop. So because of that, we're not going to be looking at a spot instance. We also don't see anything here about dedicated server licensing or any requirements from a compliance perspective that would require a dedicated instance, so that's not going to be the answer. The key thing here is maximum cost savings. So here, the way that you can spend the least for a virtual machine over a year is going to be C, reserved instance, 1 year, all upfront. Okay, next we have question 5. Your organization is looking to develop a single tool to manage deployments both on-premise and in the cloud. Which of the following AWS services could be leveraged for this? Well, in this case, S3 is not a deployment tool. Code build and code pipeline are going to be specific to the cloud. So that means our answer is going to be AWS OpsWorks. Okay, question 6. Which EC2 pricing model provides the potential for the most cost savings if your workload is flexible? Again, meaning that it can start and stop without causing an issue with the overall workload. Well, in this case, we've already kind of covered this, and that's going to be a spot instance. Next, we have question 7. Which services can be leveraged to support a hybrid cloud approach? And we touched on this briefly back in ExamPrep A. There's really 2 services here that would fit this criteria. The first is going to be Amazon Route 53, because this will enable us to have a DNS service that can work across both our cloud and on-premise infrastructure, and then AWS Storage Gateway, which gives us the ability to access our data that's stored in the cloud with a low latency connection on our local network in our data center. So next we have question 8. Which of the following is true in relation to operational expenses, OpEx, and total cost of ownership, TCO, when moving into the cloud? Now, with both of these, we know that we should have some improvements in moving into the cloud. So really, both of them should decrease. Now, a quick thing to note here, you can immediately eliminate a couple of these options, because first of all, with D, we know that the TCO will definitely change when we move to the cloud. We also know here that TCO won't increase. One of the benefits of moving to the cloud is that TCO will decrease. So really we're left choosing between both A and B. And in this case, we should see that both of those do decrease when we're not having to maintain our own data centers. So our answer is going to be A. Next, which AWS service enables you to implement infrastructure as code for your AWS environments? So this is just a service identification question. And here we can see that it's going to be CloudFormation. EC2 is for our virtual machines, RDS is the relational database service, and CodeCommit is our managed source code repository. So here the answer has to be CloudFormation. Next, we have question 10. Which of the following are pillars of the AWS well-architected framework? This is a multi-answer question, so we're going to have to select 3. Now, as a reminder, I believe you should memorize all 5 pillars of the well-architected framework. And if we look here, infrastructure as code is what we can do with CloudFormation, and loose coupling is an architectural principle that we can implement. Neither of those are going to be pillars of the framework. That means the pillars here are going to be A, C, and E: cost optimization, operational excellence, and performance efficiency. So now we'll continue the review by looking at questions 11 to 20. So here within question 11, which of the following are categories of recommendations provided by AWS Trusted Advisor? This is a multi-answer question, so we need to choose 3. So here, if we look, the last 2, least privilege access and high availability, are not concepts included in recommendations by Trusted Advisor. Least privilege access is again the process of giving a user permissions to do only what they need to do. High availability is an architectural principle, but recommendations within Trusted Advisor include cost optimization, fault tolerance, and performance. I would recommend that you do memorize the different categories of recommendations that are provided by AWS Trusted Advisor, because that will help you on the exam. Next, we have question 12. Which element of the AWS global infrastructure enables caching of assets in a global content delivery network to reduce latency for end users? Well, first of all, and this is a little bit of a bonus, when we say global content delivery network, what service are we talking about? That's going to be Amazon CloudFront. Now, if you remember, what element of the AWS global infrastructure does Amazon CloudFront utilize? It's going to be edge locations. Okay, next we have question 13. Your organization has launched multiple EC2 instances into a VPC. You need a secure way to access these servers over the public internet. What would be one approach that you could take that would align with security best practices? Now, as I mentioned in ExamPrep A, the phrase over the public internet is crucial here. That means that option A is not what we're looking for, because direct connect is not over the public internet. Next, for B, we have open up the needed ports to all IP addresses. Well, this would certainly work, however, it would not follow with security best practices. Next, we have remove all restrictions from the network ACLs or access control lists. Yet again, this does not follow security best practices. What does work is set up AWS VPN for the VPC. With this, we're able to have a secure and encrypted tunnel into our VPC utilizing a VPN. So the answer here is D. Next, we have question 14. Your organization is moving a web application that leverages MySQL into the cloud. Which approach would enable you to minimize the management tasks for this database without modifying the database interactions? Now, the interesting thing here is you don't see MySQL anywhere in the answers. The reason is because Amazon Aurora is MySQL compatible. And here we're choosing to run Aurora on RDS, and that is what is going to minimize our maintenance tasks because we don't have to maintain the underlying infrastructure that the database is running on. So the answer here would be D. Now, if you looked at some of the other options like DynamoDB, DynamoDB is a very powerful database, but it's not MySQL compatible. So you would have to completely remodel your data and change all of the database interactions if you wanted to use it. Next, we have question 15. Which resource provided by AWS provides a collection of best practices for building applications and solutions in the cloud across 5 pillars? Well, here, anytime you see 5 pillars, that's going to be talking about the AWS well-architected framework. Now, as a note here, don't get confused with the Web Application Firewall. Both have the initials WAF. Usually when you see the initials WAF, it's referring to the Web Application Firewall. In most cases, you will see well-architected framework actually written out. Next, we have question 16. Which of the following are economic benefits of switching to the cloud from a traditional data center? And this is a multi-answer question, so we need to choose 3. The first option we have is reduced total cost of ownership. And this one is definitely a correct answer because we do have reduced TCO as one of the key benefits of moving to the cloud. Also, we have lower variable operational expenditures, or OPEX. That's also true because here we get to lower our monthly cost of deploying our solutions. Now, the next one that we have is eliminating operational expenditures. Now, this is something else that's just not possible. We can't eliminate them altogether, so that wouldn't be a correct answer. Also here, we have increased operational expenditures. So this is not going to be a correct answer either because here we should decrease and not increase them. Now, as a note here, just as a test-taking strategy, one of the things you can do is you can look at D, and D is increased operational expenditures. And then we have B, lower variable operational expenditures. Now, these two are diametrically opposed. So you know that whatever your answer is, it's only going to include one of these two. So this can be a way that can just help you whittle down the answers that are there. Now, the last thing we have here is no need for upfront capitalized expenditures, or CapEx, and this is also true. That means that A, B, and E are the answers we're looking for. Next, we have question 17. Your organization needs to store roughly 2 terabytes of data for 2 years to meet compliance requirements. This data will rarely need to be accessed, but in the event of an audit, it will need to be recovered within a few days. What would be the most cost-effective solution for this use case? Now, with data archiving situations like this, there are a few things that are critical. One is how often it needs to be accessed, and then 2 is the recovery time that it takes to get the data. Now, if your recovery time is something about half a day or maybe even up to a full day, you can absolutely take advantage of Amazon S3 Glacier as long as the data rarely needs to be accessed, because here it will take that amount of time to recover the data. So here, this is going to be perfect for this use case because we only need to be able to recover it within a few days. So the answer here is going to be Amazon S3 Glacier. Next, we have question 18. Which feature of AWS organization enables you to receive a single bill for all member accounts? Well, this particular feature is consolidated billing. This isn't any of the other options that are included here. Both Cost Explorer and Cost and Usage Report are there for us to be able to analyze costs. Reserved billing is not what we're looking for, so consolidated billing is going to be our answer. Then we have question 19. Which disaster recovery approach would result in the least downtime during a disaster recovery event? Now, if you remember, we have kind of 2 different spectrums when we're talking about disaster recovery. One of them is cost, and the other is recovery time. So here, if we want to have the least recovery time, it's also going to be the most expensive option. But the answer here would be multi-site because of that, because we keep multiple copies of our infrastructure up and running all the time. That way we can seamlessly switch over to another region, and that way we can instantly route users if one of our regions stopped responding. Next, we have question 20. What AWS service can be leveraged to fully automate your build, test, and deploy pipeline for your custom software projects? So here we're looking at a service that's going to handle build, test, and deploy. Not that it's going to do all of that, but it's going to be able to automate it. So here the only option is going to be Code Pipeline, because it is able to work with other services like Code Commit in the release process, but it is what automates the integration between those. So that means it will be our correct answer. Code Artifact here is really just about storing the artifacts that we have. X-Ray is going to be a tracing service for our custom software projects. So really Code Pipeline is the only answer. So now we're going to be working through questions 21 to 30. So let's take a look at question 21. Which AWS service enables you to view, analyze, and alert on logs, metrics, and events from your infrastructure deployed on AWS? So here we've already talked about this within this ExamPrep process. This is going to be Amazon CloudWatch. Really here, because we're looking at logs, metrics, and events, that's almost always going to be CloudWatch. Other services here just don't have anything to do with that, and Amazon Logs here is not actually a service. Now, CloudWatch Logs is kind of a sub-service within CloudWatch, but CloudWatch is going to be the solution we're looking for here. Next, question 22. Your company utilizes resource tags to properly attribute expenses to specific applications and departments. This data then allows your organization to analyze all AWS spending by these categories. Which pillar of the AWS well-architected framework recommends this approach? Now here, if you're looking at this, security and reliability really don't have anything tied to resource allocation. So here you're really looking between cost optimization and operational efficiency. But here, when we're talking about allocating expenses to a department or a group, that's going to fall under cost optimization. As a reminder, review the different pillars of the well-architected framework as well as what their recommendations are. So now we have question 23. What features of virtual private clouds or VPCs enable you to limit access to your network? Now this is a multi-answer question, so we need to pick two of these. And if you look at this, there's really only two possible answers, and that's going to be security groups and network access control lists, or ACLs. Both of these are capabilities of virtual private clouds and do give you the ability to limit access to your network. Next, we have question 24. Which service provides a global content delivery network, or CDN, that leverages the edge locations in the AWS global infrastructure to enable reduced latency when sending content to end users? Well, here, anytime you see Content Delivery Network, or CDN, you're usually going to tie this to Amazon CloudFront. However, here is where you also have to be very careful with names and spend some time making sure that you memorize them exactly, because you have some names like CloudFormation and CloudFront that are very similar. Next, we have question 25. Which tool would enable you to check if you are following AWS best practices for cost optimization on your current workloads? Now, there's a couple things here to note. One of them is your current workloads. That means this needs to be a tool that's going to look at what you have deployed and then give you recommendations based on that. Also here, cost optimization is a key part of this question. So we really need to find something here that can analyze our workloads and give us recommendations on how we could better optimize our costs. Well, in this case, that's going to be AWS Trusted Advisor, because cost optimization is one of the categories of the recommendations that it provides. Next, we have question 26. Your organization is 2 months into a cloud transition, and a majority of systems have been migrated. Based on your current workload, you want to visualize current spend by AWS service, as well as predicting future costs for this workload. What tool should you leverage? Well, there's a few key parts to this question. First of all, you want to be able to visualize your current spend and predict future costs. The TCO calculator is going to help you make a case for moving to the cloud, but only that. The Cost Explorer is going to be what gives you this capability. If you remember, the pricing calculator, or the simple monthly calculator, which is the older version of that tool, is going to help you predict future costs for AWS services, but doesn't help you based on your current workload. And the cost and usage reports only looks at historical data. So here the Cost Explorer is going to be the only viable option. Next, we have question 27. Which of the following is an economic benefit of leveraging the cloud? Now, this is another economic benefit question. As I always say, make sure you read the answers and understand them thoroughly, because just the wording of these, even just one word, can change what an answer is getting at. First of all, we have elimination of variable operational expenditures. And we've seen this one before. We know we can't eliminate OpEx, so this is not going to be the right answer. Next, we have variable OpEx is tied to usage. And in this case, that is going to be the right answer, because this is one of the benefits of the cloud, is that the amount that we pay per month is going to be tied to what we use. The next one, C, increased upfront capitalized expenditures, can't be the answer, because we eliminate that upfront CapEx by not having to build out and maintain our own data centers. And then D, variable operational expenditures, OpEx, costs are unrelated to usage. And that's not what we have in the cloud, because here, one of the benefits of the cloud, as we mentioned earlier, is that it is tied to usage. So this answer is going to be B. So next, we have question 28. Which managed AWS service enables you to leverage your own encryption keys for your data with AWS services? And here in this case, there's only one service that deals with the management of your encryption keys, and that's going to be the key management service. Again, be sure you've just looked at the services list from earlier in this path. Be sure you've had a chance to review and know each of those definitions. Next, we have question 29. Where can organizations find pre-configured software from independent software vendors to run in their AWS environments? Now, you might look at this and say, well, CloudFormation is an infrastructure as code tool, so maybe that's what I'm looking for. But no, this is not going to give you pre-configured software. You can look at CloudFront and say, well, it can't be that, because in this case, that's not a global content delivery network. So the answer here is going to be Marketplace. This is where you can go find stuff from ISVs or independent software vendors to run within your AWS environment. So just make sure that you know that definition. Next, which of the following services is considered global and not region specific? So there are a handful of services, really just a few, that fall under this category. And one of the ways that you know you're dealing with one of these services is when you go into the AWS console. If you don't have to select a region, if it just says global where you would normally select a region, then it is a global service. And out of this list that we're looking at, there's only one that meets this criteria, and that's going to be Amazon Route 53. So next, we're going to talk through questions 31 to 40. So here in question 31, your organization has adopted a serverless approach for new applications. By doing this, you have decreased the amount you need to build and maintain. Which pillar of the well-architected framework recommends this approach? So here, if we look at this, 3 out of the 4 of these are pillars in the well-architected framework, and fault tolerance is not one of them. So you can mentally cross that off the list. And if you look at the others, there's only one that really deals with how you efficiently use AWS services, and that's going to be performance efficiency. So just take a minute and think about the core that is included with each of the pillars and find the one that most closely relates to the use case given in the question. So next, we have question 32. Which billing tool provides detailed usage and cost data in an Amazon S3 bucket? Let's go bottom up on this one. So AWS Cost Explorer, well, in this case, that does provide us with usage data and cost data, but it doesn't provide it in an S3 bucket. If you remember, it actually does this in a part of the AWS Management Console. We also have here AWS Trusted Advisor. Well, that doesn't really provide cost data. This gives us recommendations on the workload that we're running in the cloud. Then we have cost and usage reports, and this one seems promising because if you remember, you can enable this to put out your cost and usage data in an S3 bucket. But then the first option is S3 billing report, and we haven't talked about that at all because that doesn't exist. So the answer in this case is B, cost and usage reports. Next, we have question 33. Within the shared responsibility model, what area would be the responsibility of the customer? And this is a multi-answer question, so we're going to need to pick 2 of these answers. So here we go, let's look at this. Providing least privilege access to AWS resources. Now here, we're looking for the customer's responsibility, and that seems like a pretty good answer, so let's just put a mental check note on that one. Next, we have data center employee training. Well, here, we're talking about the data center for AWS. That's not going to be our data center, so that's definitely not going to be the responsibility of the customer. Next, we have client-side data encryption. That's another one that seems like a pretty good answer because as a customer, when you're using AWS, you're responsible for dealing with data encryption of your data. Next, we have physical data center access controls. That's also something that would be the responsibility of AWS. And patching data center network routers. That's also going to be the responsibility of AWS. All of this means A and C are going to be our answers. Now next, we have another question that's going to look at the opposite side. In terms of the shared responsibility model, what is the responsibility of AWS? So here, if we look at this, we're going to have several answers here that we're going to have to evaluate. First of all, managing network connectivity for data centers. That seems like a pretty good answer because we wouldn't have any ability to control that. Next, we have implementing server-side data encryption. Now, you might be tempted to think, oh, that's server-side, that's going to be AWS, but that is not the case. As customers, we're also responsible for server-side data encryption. Next, we have training data center employees, and that does sound like an AWS responsibility. Then we have patching the OS of EC2 instances, and if there are instances, we are going to be responsible for that. And then we have controlling application network access. That's also something that we have control over. So here, the answers are going to be A and C. Both of these would be the responsibility of AWS. Next, we have question 35. Which of the following is a best practice to follow when creating a new AWS account? First of all, we have copy the root user access keys and always use those with the AWS CLI. And I can assure you that is not a best practice. That is something that AWS recommends you not do. They actually recommend you don't use those root user access keys. Then, we have verify that multi-factor authentication is disabled for the account. And that's actually the opposite of what we'd want to do. We want to use multi-factor authentication everywhere that we can. Then for C, we have create a new IAM user that you will use instead of the root user. And that is a best practice. So here, this is going to be our correct answer. But for D, we have make sure that all senior team members have access to the root credentials. Again, we don't want to share credentials ever, so that's not going to be the right answer. So here, our answer has to be C. Next, we have question 36. You have multiple web servers deployed across multiple availability zones, and here we're assuming those are servers that you manage. What service would provide the ability to route incoming requests between these servers? So here you can look at this and say, well, Kinesis and CloudFormation, neither one of those would be the answer. They do completely different things. But when we look at Elastic Beanstalk, you might be tempted to think that, well, it can actually do routing between multiple servers, and that is true, but because we're managing these, the correct answer here is going to be D, Elastic Load Balancing. Next, we have question 37. During an audit, you learn that you will need to provide documentation for SOC 1 compliance for an application deployed on AWS. Where will you go to get the AWS compliance report for this certification? So let's look at the possible answers. First of all, we have your AWS Technical Account Manager, or TAM, the AWS Marketplace, the AWS Compliance Hub, or AWS Artifact. Now here, AWS Artifact is a service that is specific to this kind of requirement in terms of getting things like compliance reports. So this is going to be the correct answer. Next, we have question 38. After research, you determine that for a specific cloud workload, it is cheaper to run it on AWS than in your own data center when you factor in hardware cost, setup labor, and maintenance. What cloud computing benefit is best illustrated with this use case? So here, if we go bottom up, we can say stop guessing capacity. And while it's true here that in the cloud you don't have to guess capacity, that isn't really illustrated with this use case. We then have increased speed and agility. And while this organization is benefiting from the cloud, we don't really say that this benefit yet is speed and agility. So that's not what we're talking about either. Also here, go global in minutes isn't covered here because we're not talking about deploying things to a different region on the other side of the world. What we're talking about here is benefiting from massive economies of scale, meaning that Amazon has the ability to go out and buy servers and take advantage of processes that they have put in place to maintain these servers and to build out these networks in ways that just aren't possible at a smaller scale, at least for that cost. So here the answer is going to be A, benefit from massive economies of scale. Then we have question 39. Which of the following services could assist in migrating your data from your on-premise data center into AWS? Well, the first option here is Amazon Relational Database Service, or RDS. And this really doesn't play a role in migration from one location to another. It is a great database service in the cloud, but that's not what we're looking for. Then we have Amazon Elastic Block Store, or EBS. And that is a service that we can attach to our EC2 instances for block storage. Then we have Migration Gateway. Now, as of the time of recording of this course, that is not a service in AWS, which leaves us with the AWS Database Migration Service, or DMS. And that is a solution that could help migrate data from your data center into the cloud. And finally, we have question 40. You have enabled AWS CloudTrail to keep an audit log of all actions taken on your company's AWS accounts. Which pillar of the well-architected framework is followed with this implementation? So here, because you're taking an audit log, because you're using that to help make sure that there is secure access to your accounts, this is going to fall under the security pillar. As mentioned before, be sure to know the different pillars and understand the high-level recommendations provided in each of them. So we're over halfway through ExamPrep B. So let's look at questions 41 to 50. So starting off here with 41, you have chosen to break up a large application into smaller components that utilize SQS, or simple queue service queues, between each step. Which architectural principle is illustrated by this approach? Well, this is kind of a textbook example of what we would talk about with loose coupling. Now, this doesn't have to do with elastic computing. While it is kind of connected to scale, really what we're talking about here is fundamentally breaking something apart. So now we have these loose connections between the different parts of the application. Tight coupling, again, is a principle we generally don't want to have within cloud applications, and least privilege access has more to do with how we give permissions to users and services. Next, we have question 42. Where would you go to access resources to help deploy popular technologies into AWS following best practices, including step-by-step deployment instructions? So here, you might be tempted here to think about deployment and to think about CloudFormation, and that's not what we're looking for here. CloudFormation doesn't give you step-by-step deployment instructions for popular technologies. What we're really looking for here is going to be the set of resources called the AWS Quick Starts. So if you want to know how to deploy something like WordPress, for example, into AWS, this is going to be your go-to location. Next, we have question 43. Which element of the AWS global infrastructure includes multiple availability zones, enabling you to create fault-tolerant applications in the cloud that span multiple availability zones? So here, when we're talking about multiple availability zones, really there's only one answer, and that's going to be a region, because a region is made up of multiple availability zones. Next, we have question 44. Which program could you leverage to find trusted third-party consultants that can assist with your AWS workloads? So a couple notes here. First of all, you're trying to find consultants to help you, and you're trying to find third-party consultants, meaning that they don't work for your company or for AWS. So here, if that's what you're looking for, you're going to be looking for AWS Partner Network consulting partners. The marketplace isn't going to give you that. Again, the marketplace is for finding software pre-configured from ISVs to run in your AWS environment. And the Partner Network technology partners, these are not consulting partners to help you. These are partners that are building things on AWS that other people can leverage. And the AWS Directory Service also is not what we're looking for. Next, we have question 45. For auditing purposes, your organization requires that all actions performed on AWS infrastructure would be logged for at least 1 year. What AWS service could you use to implement this auditing requirement? Well, if you want to have all actions logged, there really is only one service that you would use, and that's going to be AWS CloudTrail. This is the service AWS provides for that auditing capability. Next, we have question 46. Which of the following are features of Amazon S3? And this is a multi-answer question, meaning that we need to pick 3 of these answers. So first of all, we have static website hosting. And we've actually talked about this earlier within the ExamPrep course. This is a feature of S3, so we'll put a mental check mark next to that one. That's probably going to be one of the answers. Next, we have the ability to be mounted as an NFS file system. And that is not a capability that we have with Amazon S3. If we want that capability, we're going to have to use Amazon EFS or Elastic File System. Next, we have block storage that can be attached to Amazon EC2 instances. That also is not a capability of utilizing S3. That's going to be EBS, or the Elastic Block Store. Then we have multiple storage classes to support different access needs. And this is an answer because here we have the ability to have the standard storage class. We have the ability to have infrequent access. We have Glacier Deep Archive. So that also is something that's part of S3. And finally, we have lifecycle rules to transition objects between storage classes. That also is a feature. So here we can see that our answers are going to be A, D, and E. Okay, now we have question 47. What free AWS service enables you to configure specific policies dictating what actions a user group or role can perform within your account? So one of the key words here is going to be policies, and then the other key phrase here is going to be user group or role. Now we've seen this earlier within the path in discussing how we create policies for AWS identity and access management. This is the free service that gives us the ability to configure those permissions for users, groups, or roles. Next, we have question 48. Within the shared responsibility model, what responsibility is shared by both the customer and AWS? So first, we have decommissioning data center storage hardware. And that's actually something that we're never going to touch as customers, so that's not going to be it. But then we have patch management. Now, at first, you might think that this is either all AWS's responsibility or all the customer's responsibility, but let me explain here. With patch management, AWS is going to be responsible for that base kind of hypervisor level and management of that and all of their networking equipment. We're going to be responsible for all the patches for our virtual machines at the OS level. And so because of this, this is something that's going to be shared. When we look at networking traffic protection, that's all on us as the customer, as well as client-side data encryption. So the answer here is going to be B. Next, we have question 49. Which of the following could improve the security of your organization's IAM user accounts? So first of all, we have set up AWS CloudTrail, and that's a good thing, and that actually is something that is recommended within the well-architected framework. That doesn't necessarily improve the security of our accounts. Now, it might give us the ability to do some forensic work later, but it doesn't help us on the front end. Next, we have set up the AWS Web Application Firewall. Well, this here is another good thing for your web applications, but it doesn't help your IAM user accounts. Then we have set up a password policy, and that is something you can do, and that would help with the security of your accounts. Finally, we have disable multi-factor authentication, and that's not a good thing. We would want to enable that. A matter of fact, if that said enable, that would also be a positive thing we could do for security. But as far as the question's written, it's going to be C, set up a password policy. And next we have question 50. Your organization is currently leveraging MySQL on Amazon RDS for a web application. What AWS service could enable you to cache common queries to reduce the load on the MySQL server? Now, this might require a little bit of knowledge about how these things are usually structured in terms of an architecture, but just know here that this is one of the key uses of Amazon Elasticache, is you can put it in front of your database and it can actually cache the most common queries that you make to the database. So next, we have questions 51 to 60. So here, with question 51, which factors should be considered when doing a TCO comparison analysis between a traditional data center and the cloud? And this is a multi-answer question, so we're going to need to pick 3 of these. So in this question, what we're looking for are items that are going to be different between operating in the cloud and operating in our own data center. And these would be items that you would include in this analysis. So custom software development, while it is something that you would maybe change your approach slightly, it's still going to exist in both situations, whether you're in the cloud or your data center. But if we look at the cost of servers and the cost of data storage, both of those are things that are going to be dramatically different between the two, because we're not going to be buying servers, we're not going to be buying data storage devices if we are operating in the cloud. Project management is another one that we're going to have on both. So because of that, that would not be considered. But utility costs for the data center would definitely be considered. So that means our answers here are going to be B, C, and E. Next, we have question 52. Your architecture team requires auditing of all resource configuration changes in your AWS account. Which AWS service could you leverage to meet this requirement? So as a note here, you might be tempted to say something like CloudTrail, and while you could to some extent get some of that information there, there is a service that is specifically designed for this, and that's going to be AWS Config. So next, we have question 53. Your company is looking to implement a new web application that will be used by millions of your customers. You are concerned with the scalability of the company's current relational database for this application. So you are looking for a managed NoSQL database for this project. Which AWS service provides this capability? Now, as I mentioned before, when you're looking for a NoSQL database service, you're generally going to be looking for Amazon DynamoDB. So Amazon RDS is for relational databases. Amazon Aurora is a MySQL and PostgreSQL compatible database engine. And Amazon Redshift is a column-based, columnar storage data warehousing service. So here, DynamoDB is going to be what we're looking for. Next, we have question 54. Which AWS service provides a managed data warehouse that can operate at a petabyte scale? And as I just mentioned from the previous answers, this is going to be Redshift, because this gives us the capability to operate a data warehouse really up to that petabyte scale. Then we have question 55. Which managed AWS service provides a safeguard against distributed denial of service, or DDoS, attacks? So here, this is going to be one of the security services. And the answer here is going to be AWS Shield. Config, as we mentioned earlier, deals with the resource configuration changes. GuardDuty deals with network traffic. Amazon Macie deals with finding and protecting our data. But here, AWS Shield is specifically focused on these distributed denial of service attacks. Then we have question 56. Which AWS service provides block storage for use with Amazon EC2 instances? Now, here, this is going to be Elastic Block Store, or EBS. If you remember, S3 is going to give us object storage, Elastic File System is going to give us a managed NFS service, and then Storage Gateway is what's going to enable us to work with storage in a hybrid cloud architecture. Next, we have question 57. Which service of AWS enables you to take advantage of volume discounts and usage tier discounts across multiple AWS accounts that your company manages? And in this case, this is going to be a feature of AWS organizations. And really, again, anytime you're looking at a multi-account capability, you're going to be looking at AWS organizations because it greatly simplifies the process of managing multiple accounts, including giving you this ability here, which is getting those volume discounts even if they are in different accounts. Next, what is the minimum AWS support plan that provides a dedicated technical account manager, or TAM? Well, in this case, this only comes at the very top level, which is going to be enterprise. Here, if you want that dedicated technical account manager, that's the plan that you'll have to have. Next, we have question 59. Your company wants to isolate specific applications to their own AWS account. However, they want to have a single bill that provides a clear breakdown of cost by account. What service would you recommend they use to meet these requirements? Now, this is another multi-account question, and just as before, the answer is going to be AWS organizations. Now, that being said, a few other things to note. The feature of AWS organizations that enables you to have a single bill is going to be called consolidated billing, and the service to automatically set up and automate the process of creating multiple AWS accounts in a best practices manner is going to be Control Tower. Next, we have question 60. Given regulations in some countries that your company operates in, there is a policy to ensure that your application runs on physically isolated virtual machines. What EC2 pricing model should you choose to support this requirement? Now here, this is another special use case for the dedicated host pricing model. So just as with the server licensing use case, this is another situation where this really is the only option you can leverage. So finally here for Exam Prep B, we have questions 61 to 65. So here with question 61, your organization has refactored an application that was migrated from your data center to the cloud. The application can now automatically allocate new resources to meet user demand. What benefit of the cloud is illustrated with this scenario? So here, is this fault tolerance? No, we don't actually talk here about fault tolerance. Then we have elasticity, and that seems like a pretty good answer, so let's just put a mental check note next to that one. Then we have agility, and we're not really illustrating agility here. Agility would be the ability for us to move quickly and try out new concepts. Then we have high availability. And while this might have something to do with high availability, really what we're talking about here is scale, and scale is tied to elasticity. So here, anytime you're talking about an application being able to grow and shrink based on user demand, that will be elasticity. Then we have question 62. Which AWS service enables you to create logically isolated virtual networks that you can define and configure? Well, in this case, that's going to be our VPCs, or virtual private clouds. Again, Elastic Beanstalk is not that. CloudWatch gives us the ability to look at our logs and our metrics and events. And then Elastic Network is actually, at the time of the recording of this course, not an AWS service. Next, we have question 63. Recently, your organization launched a new database using Amazon RDS. You choose to deploy the database across multiple availability zones to ensure the database could still function, even if an availability zone went down. What architectural principle does this illustrate? Now here, we can look at both loose and tight coupling, and those really don't have anything to do with what we're talking about here. We're not talking about breaking an application into smaller chunks, for example. We're also here not talking about cost optimization, because this here doesn't talk about cost at all. So the answer here has to be high availability. In this case, you're taking a high availability approach to how you're structuring your RDS instances. Next, we have question 64. Which of the following are benefits of Amazon RDS? Now, this is a multi-answer question. We're going to have to pick 3 out of this list. So first of all, provides access to the operating system through SSH. And in this case, that's actually not something provided by RDS. You can't access that OS layer when you're using RDS. Next, we have enables you to easily install customized versions of the database engine. Now, this here is also not going to be a capability of RDS. There are specific versions of the database engine that you can leverage, you can't go in and customize those versions at a deep level. There are some small customizations that you could choose to pick from, but other than that, you're pretty much out of luck. You can't make your own customizations and then install them in RDS. And since we're picking 3, we know that the next 3 are going to have to be our answers, but let's review them anyway. First of all, we have automatically patches database engine based on configured settings, and that's true. You get to pick a maintenance window for your database and those patches can be installed then. Next, we have can enable high availability by leveraging multiple availability zones. And in this case, that's also true. And I also want to call out here a test taking skill that's pretty powerful. Now, if you notice, this question here has an answer that in some ways answers the previous question when we're talking about high availability. So be sure to mark as review any of the questions that you're not sure about, because sometimes you'll find the answer in a later question. And next we have E, provides the ability to implement read replicas for most database engines, and that is also true. So our answers here are C, D, and E. Next, we have question 65. Your company wants to ensure that they have phone, chat, and email access to AWS support with a response within 1 hour when a production system is down. What is the minimum level of support that would meet this criteria? Well, in this case, it's going to be business. You get this with both business and enterprise, but because we're looking for the minimum plan, it's going to be business.
So if you've reached this point, you've had a chance to go through both ExamPrep A and ExamPrep B. If you think you're ready, go through in the certification portal and sign up for your Cloud Practitioner exam. However, if you pass, be sure to come back and let us know so we can celebrate with you. You can do that in the discussion for this video course. And also, if you found the material valuable in each of the video courses, be sure to go and leave a rating on each one. Now, in addition, if you didn't pass, or if there's something you wish you would have known when you took the exam, be sure to leave that in the discussion as well. Many of the updates we make to this course and this whole path are because of the bits of feedback that we get from learners like you. In addition, I've been able to connect with many of the learners from this path on LinkedIn and Twitter, so feel free to connect with me there. You can see the different links here on your screen. So best of luck on your AWS journey, and be sure to check out the other courses that I have here on Pluralsight.